Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji from coming live from Grenada Press. Today we have a really interesting discussion coming up with Alissa Trotz to discuss the work of Andaiye. Just to set a context. Alissa Trotz is a professor of Caribbean Studies at New College and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. She's also affiliate faculty in the Dame Nita Barrow Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. She's a member of Red Thread Women's Organization in Guyana and editor of In the Diaspora, a weekly newspaper column in the Guyanese daily Starbrook News. Together with Alissa, we have David Austin, who is one of the most important Black writers and intellectuals in North America, based in Montreal. David has been a prolific writer. He's been published widely, including Fear of a Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Societies in 60s Montreal, You Don't Play with Revolution, the Montreal Lectures of CLR James, Moving Against the System, the 1968 Congress of Black Writers, and the Making of Global Consciousness. In this conversation, David will be reflecting with Alissa on the work of Andaiye, who passed away 2 years ago on May 31st, who was one of the unacknowledged, unfortunately, and little known, but one of the Caribbean's leading radical political figures, social and political thinkers, and public intellectual. She spent all of her life in the left and women's politics in Guyana, the Caribbean, and internationally. In Guyana, she was a member of the Working People's Alliance, serving on the party's executive and as party coordinator, editor, international secretary, and women's secretaries through the period of political turbulence and the anti-dictatorial struggle that culminated in the assassination of Walter Rodney on June 13th, 1980. Alissa was responsible to working with Andaiye to bring together her writings under the heading, "The Point is to Change the World." I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome, Alissa. Thank you for joining us today. And David, thank you for once again being our moderator in this series of discussions. Over to you, David.
Well, thanks, Firoze. My pleasure. My pleasure to be doing this again, and also to be having my dear friend and comrade, can we say? Is that a good word? Yeah. Alissa Trotz. And I just want to say something very quickly, though. Firoze, those are Firoze's words, not mine. Most important Black intellectual, something along those lines. I didn't say that. I just want to be clear. In reference to me, sorry. Just to be, anyway, I think that's enough of that. So this is a wonderful book. You can see the cover there, but I'm going to hold it up anyway. This is a wonderful book by such an important figure and thinker. And you really done a service to Andaiye by helping her bring this book into being. And I know it was a great deal of work on both a personal and political intellectual level. Can you talk a bit about who Andaiye was, first of all, and how this work came into being?
First of all, thank you so much, Firoze, for having me on the show. And it's always a wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with my brother, David Austin, and to be here to talk about Andaiye's book, The Point is to Change the World. You know, interestingly, we can probably come back to this at the very end. This book was published last year. We actually have not had a launch of the book as yet, although it is being sold in worker cooperative bookstores. It's being taught in syllabi around the world. I'm, constantly getting emails from folks who've stumbled across it. We still haven't quite figured out when and how to do the launch of this book. which has a lot to do with trying to do something meaningful that kind of speaks to the collective vision that I think Andaiye wanted this book to represent, as well as her desire for this book to be useful. She said she wanted it to be seen as part of a sort of an arsenal of anti-capitalist organizing, that it should offer useful tools in the same way that she saw the work of her mentor and fellow activist and close friend Selma James's Sex, Race and Class, most recently followed this year by the publication of Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, Class and Caring for People and Planet by Selma. Andaiye, it was a Guyanese radical social activist, born in, 1942, September 11th, so very significant date for all kinds of reasons in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. September 11th is her Earth Day. September 11th is the date of the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. She grows up in what becomes a middle-class household to parents, Frank and Hazel Williams, who are nurses and then leave for England and leave her in the care of family members while her father goes off to study to eventually become a doctor and returns to Guyana. Andaiye attends high school in Guyana and then goes to the University of the West Indies, where she pursues her undergraduate degree and is, part of a generation of Caribbean folk who attend the University of the West Indies, including my own mother at the time. She and I were there at the same time, both studying French. And she returns to Guyana and begins to become involved. She describes her period at the University of the West Indies as a period of willed frivolity, and folks can have a look at the really wonderful interview that she did with David Scott in Small Acts. I believe it was in a 2001 or 2003 edition, where she elaborates on what she means by that. She comes back to Guyana in the after her stint at the University of the West Indies and starts to become involved in some radical politics with a group called Movement Against Oppression, and takes a job as a headmistress of a city high school, which is not one of the elite high schools. She's an acting principal of that school. The activism that she's involved in leads to her losing her job, and she ends up moving to New York, where interestingly she starts working at the City University of New York in their SEEK program. I believe SEEK stands for Search for Education and Elevation Through Knowledge. And there's something to be written about this period, because this is a program that Audre Lorde would teach in, and June Jordan and so many other amazing Black women would actually teach in. And I was persuaded in the late 1970s, around 1977, 1978, to return to Guyana by Rupert Narayan and Walter Rodney. And she returns to join, as Firoze pointed out, the Working People's Alliance, which was still a political movement, and becomes a political party in 1979. And she goes on to take on these executive positions within the Working People's Alliance, including the International Secretary, as Firoze points out, which is one of the ways in which she comes into contact with Selma James, because she attends a meeting in London, I think in 1982, where at the time the English Collective of Prostitutes is occupying a church, and she participates in that occupation, and that sort of leads to her involvement eventually in the International Wages for Housework campaign. I should backtrack very briefly to say that in fact she had actually met two of the women who would be the founding members of the Black Women for Wages for Housework, Margaret Prescott and Wilmette Brown, when she was living in New York in the 1970s. Anyway, so this is a longer story that hopefully we'll have some time to elaborate. But after the assassination of Walter Rodney and the collapse of the Grenadian Revolution, its implosion and the US invasion in 1983, Andaiye begins a shift out of party political activity, with the co-founding of Red Thread, the Grassroots women's organization, which is still in existence some 30 years, something years later, and becomes involved in the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action, which also emerges in the post-Grenada moment in the Caribbean, and is actually quite a pan-Caribbean organizing event. And then internationally, as I said, she gets heavily involved in the Wages for Housework campaign, and does a lot of mobilizing there, particularly in the region in relation to Haiti, and then doing some important sort of work in relation to the sort of public campaigns around the eventual Article 88, I believe, of the Bolivarian Constitution of Venezuela, which recognizes housework as work that is entitled to Social Security. So long story short, that is in a sense, a bit of her trajectory. But she's been active for decades, and maybe 10, 12, 15, I don't even remember. Years ago, we started talking about putting her work together. Some of it, conference talks, some of it talks she might have given at street corners at political meetings, some of it, talks that she would have given at the National Library, much of it letters to the press. I've just finished an essay thinking about her epistolary public interventions as a form of activism that was actually tied to what was actually taking place on the ground, especially in Guyana, but also within the Caribbean as well. And so we began talking about pulling all of this material together and making it available for a wider audience. We managed to finish this work just a month before she would die in hospital in Guyana. In fact, we thought we had finished it in December of 2018, only to be told by the publishers that we needed to make some cuts, which she was really not pleased about. And she was also by then really not well. And so I returned in April of 2019. And in the space of like 2.5 weeks, we cut 50,000 words, just to give you a sense of, the archive that she left that still hasn't been published. And she signed off on it in May, about 2 weeks before she would ultimately die on May 31st. So very long answer to your question.
No. And there's a lot of things that you've mentioned there to come back to, including, I didn't even realize that much had been cut from the book. But obviously, Andaiye was part of the Caribbean left, and you mentioned two, and this is not so much in terms of details, but more just in terms of context. You mentioned two important turning points in the kind of Caribbean left trajectory. One is the Grenada Revolution and Walter Rodney. Can you just say a few words about those, just for our audience who may not be from the Caribbean and may not understand the significance of those two contextual events, and perhaps in relation to Andaiye and her trajectory after those two events?
Well, the first obviously is the assassination of Walter Rodney, the Guyanese Pan-African historian, who is most well known internationally for his How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is written, after he completes his doctoral degree at School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He moves to Dar es Salaam, and then he returns to the Caribbean to teach at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica. This is in the 1960s, in the post-independence emerging neocolonial moment in the Caribbean. He is banned from returning to Jamaica. What happens is that he leaves to attend the Congress of Black Writers Conference, which David knows much more about than me, with Bobby Hill, at which he presents a number of papers, including one on the Jamaican situation. And the text of much of that work eventually becomes a small book that is published by Bogle Louverture. It actually is the inaugural publication, and the reason for the it's the reason for the formation of Bogle Louverture Books, Groundings with My Brothers. So he is banned from returning to Jamaica, ends up going back to Tanzania, and then returns to Guyana. I suppose the logic in a sense is that you can't be deported from the country where you were born, but you can be killed, which is eventually what happens on June 30, 1980. He is one of the founding members of the sort of Working People's Alliance. I think it's important for our audience to understand that Walter Rodney is really, seen as has been described by elders like Ayusi Koyana as the prophet of self-emancipation, and also as the historian, but also a political activist who sought to overcome the sort of racial contradictions within, among the popular forces within the Caribbean, and specifically in Guyana, among descendants of enslaved Africans and descendants of indentured Indians. And the Working People's Alliance was a multiracial movement, the likes of which had not really been seen since the anti-colonial movement of the 1950s. So he really presented a grave threat and danger. And so he's assassinated in June 13th, 1980. And I actually is, one of the editors and typed the History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1905, which is published posthumously. So there's that moment. But the region, as George Lamming has said, he comes to Guyana to sort of give a really incredible tribute to Walter in 1980. But, as Lamming has sort of pointed out, the region was still in a moment of resistance between 1980 and 1983. And then 1983, of course, is the absolute collapse of the Grenada Revolution, its implosion. And
so you're talking about George Lamming, the writer.
George Lamming, the Barbadian novelist. Sorry, yes, thank you for reminding me to contextualize. Yes, George Lamming is the Barbadian novelist who is, very close to members of the Working People's Alliance and to Andaiye. In fact, Anthony Bogues and I are working now on, we're in conversation now about possibly publishing a cache of letters from George Lamming to Andaiye that, that I have in my possession, which we're, hoping will come out in the next year or two. We're now transcribing the material and having a look at it. But yes, so the implosion of the Grenada Revolution in 1983, and, which has raised all kinds of problems about, all kinds of questions about the left in the Caribbean. The collapse of popular mobilization for Andaiye, but particularly in what leads to her founding of Red Thread and her involvement in the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action, is that it raises all kinds of questions about gender and patriarchy within the context of the Caribbean left. And in particular, one of the things she always talks about is that, during the Grenada Revolution, there was a really what appeared to be a really robust women's organization, the National Women's Organization, which was tied to the People's Revolutionary Government, that for her, she describes it as almost evaporating overnight with the collapse of the revolution. And that for her is one of the concrete material realities. There are others, coming back to her work with Salma James, but the experience of the women's arm of the PRG is one of the significant reasons that Red Thread, which is the organization that Andaiye and several of the Working People's Alliance women founded in Guyana, they were determined that it would never be an arm of a political party, that it had to have an autonomous existence outside of formal party politics.
Okay, so so the issue was that the women's organization within the PRG was a state organization as opposed to a people's organization from below. So when the state, the government collapsed, so did the organization.
Yeah, I think the point here is that it was more beholden to the party, to a particularly vanguardist notion of the party, but that they so that women didn't necessarily have an autonomous voice to address the kinds of questions that a personal and public in a personal and public sort of context that affected them as women, right? That the party line always took precedence over the question of gender, and that it became really clear after 1983 that organizing had to take a different form, and that form first found its material expression for Andaiye in the emergence of Red Thread, which was understood from the inception to be an autonomous women's organization, and then increasingly a grassroots women's organization, and then increasingly a grassroots women's organization across racial divides, which took its starting point from the unwaged everyday work that grassroots women, the unwaged caring work that grassroots women carried out daily, that was seen as really the foundation of society, invisible, marginal, but the foundation of society, and that offered a set of values, a set of relations, a set of caring practices that could produce a different kind of template for the Caribbean.
You said something, you said two things there that I think, again, take into consideration the audience who may not necessarily know the Caribbean and particularly Guyana so well. You mentioned across racial lines and also grassroots. Could you talk about why those two things are significant for any organization, and particularly a women's organization in the Guyanese context?
Can you say more about that, David? There's so much I could say.
Well, more in relation to Andaiye's conception or understanding of politics. So the grassroots part, because you're emphasizing that as opposed to just any women's organization, right? So the grassroots part seems to be important, and also across racial lines, because in the Guyanese context, we're talking about people of African and Indian descent.
So let me answer this very specifically in the context of Guyana, which is, a really sort of volatile country and topic to speak about at the moment. There is an amazing historian called Clem Cicheran who is writing a political biography of, Chadi Jagan, who was, the Marxist leader of the People's Progressive Party that comes to power in the colonial moment in 1953. And for those readers who, or those listeners who are not familiar with Guyanese politics, this is the first democratically elected government that comes to power on a the first comes to power on a Marxist-Leninist platform, first time democratically elected within the Americas. It's a multiracial, anti-colonial movement, and precisely for that reason, it's not actually allowed to stand. The two leaders at the time are Chadi Jagan and an African Guyanese barrister by the name of Forbes Burnham. They're allowed to stay in power for about 112 days before, the British troops come in, the constitution is suspended, and this leads to the actual breakup of this political movement. In 1955, it originally takes an ideological turn, the division, with moderate Indo-Guyanese leaving to join the Forbes Burnham, he's the African Guyanese leader faction, and more radical African Guyanese like Sidney King, who becomes a UC Guyana, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus remaining with the PPP. By 1957, however, the party increasingly splits along racial lines and the PPP becomes the People's National Congress. Well, one of the things that Clem Cicheran actually talks about in an essay that was published in the diaspora column that I edit in the Guyanese newspaper is that very often 1953 is spoken of as this moment of multiracial anti-colonial triumph that doesn't get enough attention. It's fully 6 years before the Cuban Revolution that we have this. And one of the things that Clem is attempting to get us to think about is that, in fact, that multiracialism was more aspirational than realized. And his position is that it was very clear, and this is also a position that is held by UC Guyana, it was very clear to the anti-colonial activists in Guyana at that moment that in any election in 1953, the People's Progressive Party would have swept the polls. It was very clear. What the argument of some of the PPP activists, UC Guyana, I believe Martin Carter and Rory Westmus among them, were cautioning Forbes Burnham and Chadi Jagan was that the time was not yet right to seek state power. In other words, enough work had not been done at the level of the masses, had not been done to overcome racial hostility and suspicion, had not enough political education had not been done. And so they cautioned that what the PPP should do is to contest a few seats and then go back to do the work. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so for Sicharan, which is drawing on the analysis of someone like Ayusi Koyana, the tragedy of 1953 is not just, you know, the suspension of the Constitution, the troops came in, the white people come in and took back over, and we had this implosion and this disintegration of a multiracial movement. The real tragedy was that there became this focus on seeking state power.
Mm-hmm.
And that focus on seeking state power without having actually done the work at the grassroots level was a moment of profound disconnection. You know, we can think of this disconnection as the emergence of the neo-colonial moment that plays itself out differently across the rest of the Caribbean. But I think Clem makes us stop to think really seriously about what this actually means in the context of Guyana. And so in that sense, Red Thread, which takes place decades later, is in the first instance an attempt to really sort of bring people together across racial divides, to begin with those who are most marginal and most vulnerable and most invisible, and that is predominantly women who have been left out of all of these equations by and large, unless they're actually participating as members of political parties. And crucially, to do that outside of the mechanisms of formal party politics that have as their end goal the competition for power. That it is by building up those capacities, by awakening people to their self-organizing capacities outside of that competition for state power, that new interests can be generated, that new solidarities across all divisions and all differences can be transcended, and that folks can actually come together to figure out what it is they're working to build and set about trying to accomplish that.
Do you think in some ways it could be said that that's part of what was inherited from the WPA before it became a party, insofar as it was a more of a popular organization? Is that one of the things that, in some respects, Red Thread inherited from the WPA, or no?
I think certainly. I mean, look, you know, it's really interesting because, and I'm trying to remember where it was that, or where it was said that, you know, one of the things that Walter Rodney had said is that he wouldn't actually have returned to Guyana unless he believed that there was some kind of chink in the armor of that albatross, which is the PPP on the one side and the PNC on the other side, this African Indian antagonism, which is largely a coastal antagonism, which up to fairly recently has largely left indigenous populations completely sort of invisible and marginalized in this competition for state power. And that in fact, one of the reasons that Walter returns is that work had already actually started. So that if in 1953 you have this kind of convulsion and this sort of splitting of a multiracial movement that Clem is saying to us, look, it is not as if that was even as solidified as you thought it was. The next moment of coming together, because the low point in Guyanese political history is the 1960s, where you have an eruption of what is euphemistically termed civil disturbances, in which Africans and Indians are sort of engaged in internecine violence in the run-up to Guyanese independence in 1966. But in a sense, 1953, if we come forward to 1973, which is the period in which the PNC would install itself after 1968, first through a coalition with the United Force, which is a pro-business party led by a Portuguese businessman, Peter de Gar.
So that's the People's National Congress, right? Just for
People's National Congress, yes. And then, you know, installs itself in power fraudulently from 1968 right up to 1992. But in the 1970s, we begin to see again a mobilization that is bringing African and Indian together, Guyanese together across race. And so even before Walter returns to Guyana, for example, you had folks from the African Society for Social and Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, which is, headed up by then AUC Guyana, who had joined the People's National Congress and then broke in the 1970s.
It's 18 hours.
The Indian People's Revolutionary Associates, one of the leading figures is Moses Bagwan, who was previously a central figure in the Progressive Youth Organization of the People's Progressive Party. But IPRA and ASCRIA actually come together in the early 1970s. And Andaiye talks about it in one of the essays in this book, but comes together in the early 1970s to sort of engage in what we, using our language today, we might describe as a land back movement, trying to get land for Guyanese on the coast and to seize sugar estate lands in order to do that. They're not fully successful, but it is an act that actually brings communities together. And during that act, one of the things that they do is hold bottom house conversations on race and political division, bottom house conversations on what is needed to sort of transcend those kinds of divides in the context of Guyana. And then remember, before Walter comes back, he has applied for a job at the University of Guyana in the history department, and the government already understanding him to be a threat. Obviously, we need to think as well about all of these Caribbean governments in conversation with each other, and hearing about his deportation from Jamaica denies him that position. Well, before he even returns to Guyana, there are huge political meetings that are organized, and AUC Guyana speaks about meetings that the police attempt to break up, but where he speaks, I think Chedi Jagan, and it's the first time since the PPP has split and he has left that he and Chedi Jagan appear on a platform together to protest against Walter Rodney's exclusion from the University of Guyana. And I also believe that at one of those meetings, AUC is actually reading to the Guyanese audience from Groundings with My Brothers, in particular the essay in which Walter Rodney is talking about how you define Blackness in the context of the West Indies. So all of that kind of work is done even before Walter Rodney sets foot at home. So, in a sense, he embodies multiracialism. He doesn't invent it. He exemplifies it in all kinds of important ways. But that work was already sort of being done and offered a condition of possibility for his return, and his activism, and then his leadership within the Working People's Alliance.
I just wonder whether we might turn to the book itself. Alissa, I'm surprised it hasn't been launched by the publishers, Between the Lines and Pluto Press, I think it is.
We had one conversation, I think, David and myself. But this book, it belongs to Red Thread, right? And so part of the holdup is not at all about Between the Lines and Pluto. As a matter of fact, I'm sure they would want me or want us to do more. It has very much to do with that.
Leaving that aside, I mean, the book is divided into 4 parts. I mean, might you just sort of take us through, what are those 4 parts? What do they deal with? What are the issues that are central to Andaiye? And I guess the sort of the question which behind that also is why is Andaiye not known, given the exceptional writing and thinking which is manifested in this book?
That second question is a harder one for me to answer. We might ask not known among whom, and certainly outside of the Caribbean, her work has not, as I said, she is largely an activist. And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to pull this collection together, because these are not essays that are necessarily published in books or in academic journals or in that sort of sense. So her work wasn't necessarily available in that way. So that's one kind of answer. I mean, the second kind of answer, I suppose I will throw it back to you all and to the audience, is not known to whom. She's certainly known in the context of Guyana. She's certainly known within the context of certain strands of the Caribbean left, absolutely. She's certainly known within the Caribbean, what we might call the Caribbean women's movement or feminist movement. And she's certainly known in international circles within the context of things like international wages for housework, or with the women who worked at national and transnational levels to get domestic work counted as part of national accounts. And I was part of the NGO, as well as advised the CARICOM governments on their submission to the Beijing conference at which that was successfully passed. And she's certainly known to those who also galvanized in the Caribbean to mobilize for domestic workers and their labor rights and their participation in the transnational organizing that would lead to the convention on, is it 188, the Convention on Decent Work at the level of the ILO. So and then she's also known, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1989, and then just about 2 decades later, she is diagnosed with breast cancer, and she starts a cancer society in Guyana, and then working with Hazel Brown in Trinidad, tries to set up something regionally in the Caribbean. So she's certainly known there as well. So I would say, she was known in many places where it really did matter. But I suppose, we could also ask the question about what it means that a Caribbean radical tradition or a Caribbean intellectual tradition is usually sort of a particular kind of list of folks, largely male, very few women, and certainly, so we might think about some of the gender dynamics in the ways in which she is included or not included, seen as an activist and not as an intellectual. I think certainly we can ask some really probing questions about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many directions we can go, but because of Firoze's question, I think one way to get at Firoze's question is by focusing on a particular part of this early on in the book, where she writes about George Lamming. Is it In the Castle of My Skin? Mm-hmm. With the character power? It's In the Castle of My Skin, I think. What is the character? Anyway, she talks about the significance of that book, and also about the question of this whole language of betrayal, which you and we've had this conversation about before, in terms of what does it mean to be born of a set of circumstances in the Caribbean, and some sort of get, for various reasons, because they achieved in school or whatever the case may be, they sort of get elevated to another class in a certain kind of way, and other folks get left behind. And that lingering feeling of having betrayed the people that from whence they came. And I wonder if we could talk about the whole language of betrayal a little bit. What does that mean within the context of the Caribbean? And just to kind of put it out there, the conversation that Alissa and I have been having is like whether is betrayal really something that we can really describe as betrayal, or is it a question of differing class interests as they evolve over time? And I just want, could you share your thoughts on that, Alissa?
Yeah, so let me just begin by saying, in response to both you and Firoze, that, the book is actually divided into 4 parts, and I'll come back to betrayal in a minute. Mm-hmm. It is no accident that she begins with organizing. And in fact, the essay on betrayal is called The Historic Centrality of Mr. Slime, George Lamming's Pursuit of Class Betrayal in Novels and Speeches. So she is talking about Castle of My Skin and Season of Adventure, but she's also talking about several of his essays, like The Honorable Member, several of his speeches, because she talks about the fact that after the collapse of the Grenada Revolution and sort of what the failure of the left, Lamming sees speeches and talks that he gives as doing a certain kind of a certain kind of work. As he says, I think she quotes him, novels are a way of educating feeling, whereas the speeches are a way of making the mind feel. So the first section is lessons from past organizing, and I'll come back to why it was ordered in this way. And the rest of the book is really sort of saying, where do we take the learning from part 1 through to parts 2, 3, and 4? In other words, the book is sort of driven by what I would describe as a really, I've talked about the politics of precision, but today I suppose what I would talk about is a really rigorous reflexivity, an autocritique that is really at the heart of everything that Andaiye talked about and actually embodied. And so if in a sense we see parts 2, 3, and 4 as really trying to sort of center the unwaged work of women and the organizing capacities of the popular, in a sense, part 1 is about for want of a better word, part 1 is about what happens when you miss seeing that, what happens when you ignore that, what happens when you bypass that. And so essay 1, for example, is actually a critique of contemporary feminist politics and organizing in the Caribbean. And these critiques are critiques that she absolutely implicates herself in, right? So essay 1 is really sort of a critique of the period of structural adjustment and a turn away from movement building to NGOization. And essay 2 is also reflexive in that she is trying to work out why it was she didn't see this concept, why she didn't see betrayal until much later. And she has to come to terms with the fact that she is part and parcel of that betrayal, and that she couldn't see it until she left the political parties, until she left the left, for want of and not left the left, but, left the traditional left within the region. Was she able to see that she and so many others were part of the problem because they saw themselves as the solution. And in fact, and then, she reflects on that in essay 3, which is really a spectacular essay about Grenada, goes into it in some more detail in 4. Section 2 is where she is sort of reflecting on some of the limits of organizing in Guyana, again, with that sort of reflexivity, with the 3 letters against race violence. If anyone is familiar with Guyanese politics and Walter Rodney's speeches, it's really important to read those 3 letters against race violence alongside one of what I consider to be Walter Rodney's best speeches, which is In Defense of Arnold Rampersad. And then in part 2, if you go down just a bit there, Firoze, that essay, further down, right, essay 13 is a really critical essay as well on housewives and other carers in the Guyanese resistance, where she's actually reflecting on an earlier organizing moment when she was still with the party, still with the Working People's Alliance, and completely misrecognized what housewives were actually doing. And the basis of that misrecognition, and that misrecognition was the basis for, not the basis, was at the heart of the sort of the collapse of something that was actually emerging and that could have been nurtured as seeing housewives as an autonomous sector of the working class, as opposed to just housewives. So it's all layered with that reflexivity. So if we go back up, really long responses to you, but if we go back up, therefore, the historic centrality of Mr. Slime, Selma James gave a spectacular book launch last week for her new book, Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, Class, and Caring for the Planet. And close to the end of her talk, she said something that just stayed with me ever since, because I think it is completely aligned with this particular essay. And Andaiye is very clear that these are not chapters. I have numerous emails from her saying, do not call them chapters. They are essays. You are academics. These are essays. They're not, and they have numbers. They're not chapters. But at the end of that talk, Selma said, ambition is the enemy of any movement. Ambition is the enemy of any movement. And, you know, we have to be very clear what we mean by ambition, because in one of his speeches, which I think he gave at the memorial service for Maurice Bishop, Lamming describes ambition differently. It's a speech called Tragedy of a Whole Region, where he says that Rodney and Bishop gave the word ambition a new virtue. It was a commitment to break in a decisive way, and I'm quoting here, it was a commitment to break in a decisive way with the tradition which had trained them to approve and supervise over the intellectual enslavement of their people. That's an ambition that understands that the condition of your possibility is all of the work that is done in the case of, and I mean, here we're talking both in terms of Rodney, Bishop, but also Andaiye, but the work that is done to educate a class of people, educate them away from our roots, educate us away from the working peoples of the Caribbean, educate us to believe that we are somehow better, that we are now leaders, that we have a superior sort of insight or capacity. It is a kind of ambition that lives very closely to authoritarian and personalized forms of leadership. And I think very clearly when in this essay, the historic centrality of Mr. Slime, this is the class betrayal that Andaiye is talking about, and that she follows through in essay, well, in all of these essays from essay 1 to essay 7, that if we were to go back and try to read the sort of the history of the Caribbean through this lens of betrayal, we would want to think about the ways in which the sort of the forces of change. We could go all the way back if you wanted to go to Cedric Robertson's Black radical tradition, right? We could talk about the Haitian Revolution, we could talk about the Morant Bay Rebellion, but certainly in the 1930s, the kinds of labor riots that erupted on the streets across the Caribbean that are then squashed by the World War. And then in the post-war moment, where movement leaves the streets and enters into what George Lamming calls the theatrical chambers of parliament, right? So it gets narrowed, the theatrical chambers of parliament with these representatives. And I'm smiling because I'm thinking about the ending. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but the ending of The Sea is History, poem by Derek Walcott, where he has the bullfrogs and the herons and the, you know, and sort of talks about that neo-colonial moment with these so-called political representatives. And we want to call this democracy. We want to call this independence. We want to call this somehow sovereignty. And so I think this is the point that Andaiye makes, and it's why she wants to begin the book in this way, to clear the way, to recognize that, as George Lamming says, and I'm quoting him again, a society is as free as its poorest citizens. And having cleared the way in sections 1 and 2, sections 3 and 4 are really about making that case.
Firoze, you have a follow-up question?
Well, I'm just thinking of it from the point of view of saying that there's both a sort of the political, but there's also the personal level in terms of her own experience of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and her critique of medicine and her affinity for the alternatives to conventional medicine. Can you talk a little bit more about, I mean, this incredible situation which she describes that it's sort of an iatrogenic condemnation. She's suffering from a treatment that was carried out many years previously. How does that work out in terms of her politics and her understanding of medicine and the politics of medicine?
Well, you know, as I said earlier, in 1989, and I was actually in my final year. I've known Andaiye all of my life. I was actually in my final year of university here in Toronto. She was diagnosed and had come up to Canada to sort of get a second opinion. She was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and underwent some really invasive chemotherapy in Barbados, which sent her cancer into remission, but destroyed her body, right? And so, so she lived for over 2 decades with the devastating effects of chemotherapes, which, as she would go on to research, had sort of been developed through the military-industrial complex. And so she describes her encounters with chemotherapy in that sort of way, drawing on other writers like Susan Sontag and Gubar and others, in which her body becomes literally a sort of battlefield and kind of collateral damage. She's left with heart problems. She's left with emphysema. She's left with, just really debilitating physical conditions. And then she is diagnosed again in 2012, I think it is, with breast cancer and opts for a mastectomy, which, because of her weakened condition, she has to undergo without general anesthesia, because the effects of the chemotherapy are such that she can't actually withstand anesthesia. But what she does is, it's interesting because she meets Audre Lorde in the Caribbean at a CAFRA conference in 1988, and they actually become really close writing friends. And in fact, she has one of the essays, one of the best and most wonderful essays in here is a tribute to Audre Lorde after her death. And like Audre Lorde, she turns that fear and that silence into a concerted effort to not only speak about her personal journey with cancer, but to make her personal journey anything but personal. In other words, she attempts to, not only in her writing, but in her practice through establishing the Cancer Society in Guyana and the network to try to get low-income Guyanese out to Trinidad for treatment. And one of the young persons that she she works very closely with and is really deeply affected by is a young man named Brad DeClue, who is diagnosed with the same testicular cancer that Lance Armstrong is diagnosed with. I can't remember if she mentions it in the book, but we certainly published posthumously a longer essay where he is mentioned. And he doesn't have the resources. He is in Guyana. So those kinds of international asymmetries and imbalances are part of what she is absolutely talking about. That's the first thing. The second thing, as you pointed out, Firoze, is that she is also talking about is the way in which the Western medical establishment is so based on a language of separation that makes one's own experience unintelligible to oneself. And she talks about her father, who was a physician, who always approached medicine as art. And in fact, there's some wonderful parts of this essay, and certainly the longer one, where she talks about medicine as art and medicine, therefore, as the capacity to listen, to understand that we bring different bodies and different experiences, and an attunement to what that actually means and what it actually entails. So part of her analysis, both about international sort of inequalities, part of it is about the way in which the Western medical establishment segments and separates and makes us unintelligible to ourselves in ways that we need to contest. And then the third part of it, again, comes out of her long organizing experience with Red Thread and with Wages for Housework and the global strike, is about the caring work without which, she says, quite frankly, she would not have survived. And this caring work involved her brother, Abyssinian Carto, but was predominantly networks of women in Guyana, in the Caribbean, and in the world who literally held her up, found her employment, cared for her, looked after her, accompanied her to the doctor, asked the kinds of questions that she was in no physical state to ask or get answered. That it is that sort of caring, supportive labor that was actually critical and crucial to her being able to navigate this this system and this devastating disease. And it was also a caring network which was on display in the last 2.5 weeks when, it became shockingly clear to us that she was not going to make it, because when she went into hospital in mid-May, she was not well, but none of us, including Andaiye, thought that she was not going to make it. She thought she was going to be coming out of there, and so did we. And so the network that got mobilized around the world and in Guyana and in the Caribbean was just, again, an exemplification of that, but also was what we had learned from her. In her foreword, Honor Ford Smith talks about the absence of care is death. And it wasn't just that we were able to give that care to Andaiye, but it is also what we learned from that, the ways in which we were enriched in that process, what we have taken from that in our own life's work and journey.
So go ahead. No, go ahead, Firoze.
Because I think I can't remember. I think it's Tony Bogues who raises the issue that those people who are ill and are connected with networks have a much greater survival rate than those who are not. And I think it's a really politically important issue that community is really an essential part of politics as well as of health. But the question I wanted to ask us quickly is, you talked about earlier 50,000 words taken out. What kind of issues were dealt with there, which ought to have been, in your view, part of this collection?
None. In the sense that, look, there was so much, and I was pissed as hell when it turned out that we had to cut this. But I know without a doubt that in April, once we had trimmed the book, she was so much happier, and she explicitly said that she was so much happier with what we had managed to do, that she agreed that by then it was a bit too unwieldy. And if you bring me back or we have time, every time I read this book, I get something else from it, even though I've edited it, and it is so tight. She was happy with it. She wasn't quite finished, at her hospital bed in ICU before she was unable to speak. She was still taking notes on her computer. The timestamp shows that she was still working on things during her time in hospital. The final essay on Walter Rodney, there were some things that she wanted to come back to. The final essay on the contemporary Caribbean struggle, the postscript, which was italicized, was not complete. That's why it's still italicized, because there were some parts of it that she was not pleased with. But everything that had to come out, which isn't to say these were not really important things. There's an amazing interview with Kamala Kempadu on Red Thread's methodology of counting on-wage work and using time use surveys as a basis for political organizing and for mobilization and for political consciousness. The best example of this was in the 2005 floods, when they mobilized housewives to completely challenge the government and the international community to count what they had lost. So there's that. There were some wonderful other tribute essays, one to Shiv Narayan Chandapal, who is a well-known Guyanese cricketer, and a really sort of important essay that talked about Shiv within the context of thinking about cricket. So it would have been really beautiful to publish that and to think of that alongside CLR James' discussion of cricket and West Indian identity, for example. And but there's so much more. Between 1997 and 2001, Andaiye ran a column. She didn't write every week, but she edited a column in the Starbrick News, which is kind of the inspiration for my own column, called Women's Eye View. So there is a lot of unpublished material. As literary executor, we've just only begun to start going through and looking at that and trying to think about what the next steps are to do, what the next steps would be with her archive.
Well, it sounds like the prospect of another publication. I don't know how much time we have left, but I do want to ask at least one more question.
Go ahead.
And it's the title itself, because I know the title must have been chosen with a great deal of thought, and just thinking about Andaiye as an intellectual, right, who was an organizer and politically engaged, a political activist. Right? And we think about the statement of the book, the point is to change the world, in relation to, well, I guess the question could become, well, what would be the other point, and why that title? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to me, and maybe it's pretty obvious to most folks. If we're not talking about, in other words, if we're not talking about changing the world, what are we talking about in a time of crisis, madness, and mayhem? But why that title? And what did it mean to Andaiye? Because she must have signed up on the title.
Because for her, the point was to change the world. I mean, the title is in fact her premise, and I think again, think about it really carefully. I think the book itself and the structure of the book answers that question, and that's why I said it's really instructive that she begins with this critique. And the critique is not of capitalism, because there's a way in which the critique. I mean, it is of capitalism, but the critique is not of. She ends with that essay, which has the postscript, which is talking about the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of fascism, the rise of populism, etc. She doesn't begin there. Her critique begins with a critique of the left in the region. And I think that's something for folks to really stop and think about, why she begins with that self-critique. So for her, I would say that, absolutely, the point is to change the world. In other words, this can't be half-assed. It can't be reformist. She's writing in a moment of intense NGOization within the context of the Caribbean. One of the things that was centrally on her mind and to which she was completely sort of obsessed with was the situation in Haiti. That formed a big part of the work that she did with Margaret Prescott on the global strike. And she often talked about the fact that if you think about NGOization and the fact that there were more NGOs per capita on the ground in Haiti than anywhere else in the world, still in 2010, 300,000 people had to die from that devastating earthquake. What does that tell you about the failure of a political imagination that ties its fortunes to NGOs and to the recolonization, what the late Jamaican economist Norman Gervin describes as policy recolonization via the International Monetary Fund. So for her, this had to be structural change. It couldn't be anything reformist, but it had to be different. And there had to be lessons that were learned from our experiences of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, which is the period that she actually experienced. And so I think that's why she's saying it has to be a large vision, but it can't be the same vision. And so we're beginning by talking about the failures and the blind spots of the left before we lay out what she says is you have to challenge capitalism by organizing against all the work they make us do, which involves, and I'm just quoting this one sentence, unifying the struggles of all sectors against capital, ensuring we begin with those with the least power and resources in the capitalist hierarchy so that all are included. The least power and resources in the capitalist hierarchy takes us directly to unwaged workers and directly to women. All are included offers us a vision that asks us, therefore, to think about questions of gender, of race, of class, of sexuality, not as some sort of separatist identity politics, but identities that are tied to specific sectors that traditional forms of left organizing have left out of the picture, but also that sectors that need to also fully integrate an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist framework into their organizing. And the last thing I want to say about the point is to change the world is that what she was calling for was about radically expanding the space of politics, radically expanding the space of politics beyond the 5-year Westminster cycle in the Caribbean, beyond the sort of, beyond the narrow electoral political cycle. So organizing at the local level, at the community level, every email from her, every meeting in person was always about bringing young people on board. Where is the movement? Where are we organizing? There is action happening. Even in her most pessimistic moments, she firmly believed that there was social motion. And our task and our job is to attach ourselves to it. Facing reality, I think Grace Lee Boggs and CLR James sort of talk about that, but her belief was that we have to attach ourselves to that, learn from it, describe it, understand what those capacities are, and that is what can actually result in the kind of change that she was hopeful could be accomplished in the context of the Caribbean.
A politics that is anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic. And she goes on to say, the left says that identity politics is narrow, but the left's definition of what is political and who is political has its own narrowness. Identity politics challenges those of us rooted in traditional left organizing to move beyond the narrow view of class, or put another way, to recognize all sectors that capital makes potential allies of. Then lastly, she says here, similarly, why we need organizing against the forms of exploitation, subordination, and discrimination that the left has traditionally ignored or downplayed, our organizing must also be anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. And this is the part that I really like, because there's a sense of a deep and abiding sense of humility. I don't pretend to know how we will rebuild the movements to change the Caribbean world and the world in general, and build it better than it ever was. But I am sure that divided action is not taking us in that direction.
Absolutely. How could you be prescriptive with that kind of, you could not, the prescription, it's a form of arrogance. How could you be prescriptive? She was absolutely reflective. And I would just say, to close, I mean, I would urge folks to read essays 13 on housewives and other carers in the Guyanese resistance, and essay 6, organizing within and against race divides, because that's where she really lays it out. And if you really want to take it further, this is what she wanted, was for people to study and to read this together. Would be to read it alongside Selma's new book, and the last part on the organizational strategy of autonomy. She actually has one essay called Andaiye, the Uses of Autonomy. Selma goes one further. She doesn't even have numbers in her book. Andaiye has no chapters, but numbers. Selma doesn't even have numbers. And there's a difference between autonomy and separatism. And for Andaiye, identity politics is negative when it leads to separatism. It is not when it offers autonomous spaces for sectors to organize in order to rejoin the larger movement in a context in which we're not going to be simplistic or naive to assume that we're all the same, or that there are not levels of power among us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even her own life showed her break with the sort of state-oriented politics of the left, and a demonstration of a faith that people can and do think politically, and therefore organizing popular democracy is the only way to go forward. For therein lies the possibilities of a universalist humanity, which is, I think, what you were hinting at there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This has been a really, really interesting discussion. I mean, Alissa, I could sit here and talk with you all night, but I think our audience is going to be less tolerant of that. Although I think further discussions with you on a range of different topics is needed. So I really want to thank you for sparing time to join us. And as always, David, thank you for leading the discussion and helping bring Alissa to the screen for us, which I think has been a great thing for us.
No, she was fantastic, Alissa. Yeah, really, and I think it was great for the audience. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I learned a great deal. So just to say to everyone watching, thank you for joining us today, and that we will be back with further discussions, not only with Alissa, but with others, as we try and explore some of these political issues, which I think are central, and which Andaiye has been so articulate in her whole life history of dealing with, and a capacity she has for self-critical reflection, I think is really something.
Something we can all learn from. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. So I will close the show, but please don't run away. We can have a conversation when the broadcast ends.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It's been great. Thank you for joining us.
Take care.
This is Firoze Manji signing off on Daraja Press and the discussion on The Point is to Change the World, edited by Alissa Trotz, and a collection of extraordinary writings by Andaiye.